While the world was busy watching China build roads and ports across Africa, something else quieter, smaller, but far more powerful began unfolding in the workshops of Lagos, Nairobi, and Ouagadougou. There, beneath tin roofs and the hum of welding machines, a new revolution was born. Not a revolution of protest or politics, but of production, a silent uprising of machines and minds determined to free a continent that has long been told it cannot make for itself. Across Africa, engineers who once dreamed of importing heavy equipment from Europe now build their own. Young men and women who once waited for Western investors now pick up tools, write code, and assemble technology adapted to Africa's realities. Dusty roads, unstable power-limited capital. It's not perfect. It's not polished. But it's happening, and faster than anyone predicted. In Zimbabwe, a single modular battery line worth just $15,000 now supplies solar systems across southern Africa. In Ghana, small 3D printers make hotel linens. In Kenya, solar-powered food processors save entire harvests. These are not isolated miracles, they are signals of a coming industrial dawn. For over a century, the world defined Africa by its raw materials, gold, oil, cocoa, and copper. But what if the next century defines Africa by its machines? What if the continent that once fueled the world now begins to build it? That is the question this story asks you to consider. Because this is not just about Africa's factories, it's about who controls the future of work, of industry, of dignity. So before we go further, ask yourself, when the next wave of global innovation rises, will Africa still be the workshop of others, or finally its own? Please share this story if you believe Africa's silent industrial revolution deserves the world's attention. And subscribe if you still believe, like we do, that production is the new freedom. It began not with grand speeches or billion-dollar investments, but with a $15,000 machine tucked away in a small workshop in Harare, Zimbabwe. The year was 2023, and a local company just 3 years old received an unexpected email. It was from one of Tesla's battery suppliers. They didn't want raw lithium, they wanted finished batteries made in Zimbabwe. For decades, Africa was told to export minerals and import products. But this moment flipped that equation upside down. With a single modular assembly line imported from China, this Zimbabwean startup began producing solar batteries enough to power entire rural communities. Within just 10 months, that machine paid for itself. Within 2 years, it became the beating heart of a local energy industry. When researchers visited the factory, the owner said a sentence that now echoes across the continent. "I used to think we needed factories like China. Then I realized we just needed their machines." That insight, simple yet revolutionary, captured the essence of a new African awakening. It wasn't about building another Shanghai or Shenzhen. It was about building something African, something that could survive dust, heat, and unstable electricity. Across the continent, the same pattern emerged. In Cameroon, factories that adopted automation reported 15–30% higher productivity, up to 30% more output, and 50% fewer breakdowns. In just the first quarter of 2025, machinery imports rose 30%, proof that African businesses were investing, scaling, and betting on themselves. But what drove this wave? Part of it was demographics. Africa's youth, the youngest and fastest growing population in the world, was demanding jobs, not aid. Governments and entrepreneurs alike realized that scalable manufacturing wasn't just an economic choice, it was a survival strategy. Then came leapfrogging, the art of skipping over the old to reach the new. Since most African factories were built from scratch, they didn't inherit the rigid, outdated systems of the West. Instead, they could install AI-driven robotics and smart sensors from day one, integrating digital control and automation into their DNA. The final spark came from policy. The African Union's Digital Transformation Strategy 2020-2030 made smart manufacturing a continental goal, aligning nations to invest in the same technological future. For once, Africa wasn't following instructions from Washington or Brussels. It was writing its own blueprint for progress, and it was working. Factories once dark and silent now glowed at night with blue LED lights and the hum of precision motors. Entrepreneurs who used to beg for credit were now signing deals with local banks, small loans, big impact. Every machine bought became a classroom. Every workshop became a lab. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Nairobi to Ouagadougou, something profound was taking shape, an industrial rhythm powered by African determination and ingenuity. When the world looked at Africa, it still saw poverty statistics, but inside Africa, people were seeing potential. Young welders became automation engineers, artisans became data analysts. The dream of independence, once political, was now mechanical. And somewhere in that shift, a truth was born that freedom in the 21st century is not just about who governs you, but about who builds your machines. So when the dust rose above Harare that morning and the first battery rolled off the line, few outside Zimbabwe noticed. But history might, because in that moment, Africa quietly entered its next revolution, not one of protests and flags, but of blueprints and bolts, wires, and willpower. This was not aid. This was agency. Not dependency, but design. Not waiting for the world, but building it one machine at a time. The turning point came when the machines themselves began to speak with an African accent. In Cape Town 2024, a small engineering firm called Adavis Solutions unveiled something no one thought possible: the Hyrax, Africa's first locally manufactured metal 3D printer. It wasn't imported from Germany, and it didn't need European supervision. It was conceived, designed, and assembled by African engineers who understood the realities of African production: unreliable power, dust-filled workshops, and long waits for spare parts. The price tag, $180,000. That might sound steep until you realize that comparable Western models cost over $1 million. The first buyer was a mining company that used to spend $50,000 every month ordering spare parts from Germany. Shipping delays would cost them 3 months and nearly $200,000 in downtime. Now, they print those same parts in-house in 3 hours at $5,000 per month. But the real triumph wasn't just about cost. It was about control. For the first time, African companies didn't have to wait for help. They could repair, invent, and adapt on their own terms. That realization rippled across the continent. In Ghana, a startup called EcoBlocks turned plastic waste into paving stones using small hydraulic machines that cost less than a used car and made $3.7 million in a single year. In Kenya, cooperatives used solar-powered food processors to cut post-harvest waste by 60%. In Nigeria, local recycling startups built a $50 million plastic industry in just 5 years. In Ethiopia, industrial parks saw double-digit growth directly linked to automation. And in Morocco, locally built food processing lines were now being exported across West Africa. The message was clear: Africa was no longer waiting for technology. It was becoming technology. Global observers started taking notice. Economic think tanks in London and Washington released cautious reports about localized industrial adaptation. Western manufacturers, once confident that Africa would always be their customer, began to feel the tremors of competition. Still, the skeptics came forward. They said, "You're still buying Chinese machines. You're not building capacity, just dependency." But those on the ground saw something the critics couldn't: a learning curve. As one Cameroonian engineer put it, "Every machine we buy is a teacher. Every breakdown is a lesson. Every repair is a step toward independence." He wasn't wrong. Across Nairobi, Lagos, and Ouagadougou, local technicians were modifying imported systems, adapting them to run on solar power or to print their own replacement parts. This wasn't imitation, it was evolution. By 2025, a quiet confidence had begun to spread. Entrepreneurs who once imported blueprints from Europe were now drawing their own. Young graduates who once dreamed of jobs in Paris or London were choosing to stay home to build. And that's when the emotion hit pride, not just in profit, but in purpose. For too long, Africa's narrative was written by others: colonial economists, foreign investors, global lenders. Now, for the first time in a century, Africa was writing in the language of creation. In those moments, the sound of progress wasn't the applause of politicians or the buzz of foreign aid conferences. It was the hum of a 3D printer in Cape Town, the rhythm of a solar-powered food mill in rural Kenya, the clanging of a recycling press in Lagos. That's the sound of a new kind of revolution, not a loud one, but a determined one. A revolution measured not in protests or speeches, but in kilowatts, spare parts, and export orders. And as that revolution grew, even the world's biggest players from Silicon Valley to Wall Street began to realize that Africa's rise wouldn't come with warnings or fanfare. It would come with machines. Every revolution begins with machines, but it never ends there. Because when people start to build things, they also start to believe things about themselves, about their country, and about their future. The new industrial wave sweeping across Africa is not just reshaping factories, it is quietly redrawing the social contract between governments and citizens. In countries long haunted by unemployment and dependency, these new workshops powered by small machines and big determination have become laboratories of dignity. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has been one of the loudest voices linking technology to sovereignty. Under his leadership, local cooperatives have received direct state support to develop fabrication tools, agricultural processors, and small-scale refineries. His philosophy is simple yet radical. A nation that cannot produce what it consumes will always serve those who can. That idea now resonates far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Factories once owned by foreign investors are slowly giving way to community-based manufacturing cooperatives. In towns like Koudougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, young engineers share open-source designs for solar dryers, irrigation pumps, and cement mixers. Their goal is not only to make money, but to make meaning. To prove that African labor, when equipped with tools, can create value equal to any corner of the world. Civilly, this movement is transforming how people think about work. Where jobs were once symbols of survival, they are now acts of creation. Women lead recycling collectives in Lagos. Farmers in Ghana own shares in local processing plants. For the first time, African citizens are not waiting for policy changes from above, they are engineering change from below. Politically, the impact is seismic. Governments that once relied on foreign aid to maintain stability are discovering a new kind of legitimacy earned through production, not donation. Every machine purchased domestically, every tool built locally, weakens the grip of the financial empires that once dictated African economies. This shift is also forcing politicians to evolve. In Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria, leaders are being judged not by the speeches they give, but by the industries they ignite. You can no longer campaign on promises of foreign investment. People now ask, where are our own machines? And that question, simple as it sounds, is revolutionary. It challenges a century of colonial economics and a generation of dependence on the IMF and the World Bank. It's not the kind of revolution fought with rifles, but with routers, robots, and rivets. There's a new social pride forming, the pride of making. When a young welder in Burkina Faso watches his prototype hammer press stamped "Made in Faso," he isn't just shaping metal, he's reshaping identity. He is part of a civil movement that doesn't march on the streets but builds in workshops. And in that silent motion of gears and grinding steel lies a profound political truth. The real power in this century belongs not to those who own the oil, but to those who own the machines. In Washington, analysts are puzzled. How could a continent once defined by poverty statistics now threaten to rewrite the very rules of global manufacturing? For decades, Africa was the endpoint, a market for foreign goods, a supplier of cheap minerals. But the rise of small, smart, affordable machines has turned that hierarchy upside down. When Zimbabwe produces lithium batteries for Tesla, when Ethiopian industrial parks double their output through automation, when Morocco exports food processing machines across West Africa, that's not charity, that's competition. In boardrooms from Detroit to Berlin, executives are beginning to see what this means. Every African entrepreneur who builds a 3D printer, every cooperative that replaces imports with local production chips away at the dominance that Western industries have held for centuries. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it's happening at scale. To older Americans who once watched their own factories close and move overseas, this story might feel familiar, but reversed. The same globalization that once hollowed out the American Midwest is now meeting resistance in Africa. Instead of losing industries, Africa is gaining them not through foreign outsourcing, but through domestic reinvention. Even China, once seen as Africa's great industrial mentor, is watching closely. Beijing's engineers are realizing that African firms are no longer passive buyers. They're now competitors. The continent is no longer content to assemble. It wants to design. Western economists, cautious as ever, describe it as industrial localization. But Africans call it what it truly is: sovereignty. Because when a Burkina technician can repair his own machine without waiting for parts from France, when a Kenyan farmer can process and sell his crops without paying shipping fees to Europe, that's not a shift in trade, that's a shift in power. From the American perspective, the implications go beyond economics. For the first time, Africa's progress is not built on aid packages or military alliances. It's built on data design and digital independence. And that challenges the very foundation of U.S. soft power, the idea that development must follow Western blueprints. Some American investors are adapting fast. Diaspora entrepreneurs are returning home, investing in workshops, training engineers, and supplying capital not to governments but to communities. They see what mainstream media still misses, that Africa's quiet industrial awakening is one of the most important geopolitical stories of the 21st century. Even the International Monetary Fund, once Africa's economic gatekeeper, has begun to issue warnings not about debt this time, but about disruption. A world where Africa no longer imports its essentials is a world where the West loses leverage. For many Americans, this could feel like déjà vu, watching another region rise while their own factories rust. But there's also a lesson here. Progress doesn't belong to those with the biggest machines, but to those with the boldest imagination. And as Africa reclaims its right to make, the question for the West becomes painfully simple. Will you partner with this new Africa or try once again to contain it? There's an old African proverb that says, "When the roots of the tree begin to decay, it spreads death to the branches." For too long, Africa's roots, its factories, its workshops, its makers, were neglected while the branches were decorated with foreign loans and imported goods. Now, for the first time in modern history, those roots are being strengthened again. Not with slogans, not with aid, but with machines built, maintained, and dreamed by Africans. What began as a whisper in the workshops of Harare and Nairobi is becoming a roar across the continent. The world may still underestimate Africa, but Africa no longer underestimates itself. This revolution does not wave flags or hold protests, it welds programs and prints. It is a movement of quiet hands, stubborn hearts, and unstoppable minds. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has said it clearly: true independence begins when our people can produce what they need with their own hands. His words now echo in the corridors of power across the continent, from Ghana to Kenya, from Morocco to South Africa. And if this industrial awakening continues, it will not only reshape Africa's economy, it will rewrite its destiny. But let us not be naive. Every revolution faces resistance. The same forces that once drew borders on African soil now draw economic boundaries through trade deals and data control. The same institutions that loaned Africa into dependency will not easily surrender their influence, which is why this moment matters. Because the age of African self-reliance is not inevitable, it must be protected. And here's where you, the viewer, come in, especially those who remember what it felt like when American factories still hummed, when industry meant pride, not profit alone. Africa is now living that same turning point, the moment when making becomes meaning. The question is, will the world nurture this growth or fear it? If Ghana can innovate with $2,000 machines, if Burkina Faso can design tools under sanctions, if Cape Town engineers can build Africa's first industrial 3D printer, what excuse do we have left to doubt the continent's potential? Because the truth is, simple: production is power. And this time, Africa isn't asking for permission. It's building the future on its own terms. Please share this video if you believe Africa's industrial revolution deserves global recognition. Subscribe if you believe, as we do, that the next century of progress will not be written in Washington or Beijing, but in Ouagadougou, Nairobi, and Accra. For as we always say here, the more we empower Africans, the greater Africa and the world will become.